In 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina was the kind of place that made some people mad simply by existing. The city was majority black, run in part by black elected officials, with thriving black owned businesses, a popular black newspaper, and a middle class that was doing well enough to own houses, send their kids to school, and wear the kind of hats you could only pull off if your credit was good. It was incredible. Black and white residents were working together politically through something called the Fusion Movement. I mean, they weren't spooning by the campfire or anything, but they were making policy and passing laws that benefited working people of both races. This was the Jim Crow era South, remember, so it was about as close as you could get to a utopia without electricity in every home or the internet to complain about it on. Naturally, that almost utopia had to be destroyed. To understand the Wilmington coup, you have to know the mood among the white elite of North Carolina in 1898. They just watched the Fusionists win multiple elections. They saw black men in public office, in law enforcement, and running businesses that, gasp, white people patronized. There was actual interracial cooperation happening, and instead of wondering if there wasn't something to this whole equality thing, they thought, oh my God, this is 100% a problem and definitely one that only guns can solve. So with an election on the horizon, the state's Democratic Party, which, yes, back then was the party of segregation before the 1960s brought both the civil rights movement and the Southern strategy, launched what they openly called the white supremacy campaign. No subtlety, no euphemisms. It was a months-long tour where newspapers cranked out racist cartoons and candidates plastered towns with posters warning that black political power would destroy white civilization, all while giving rousing speeches about redeeming the state from the horrors of, democracy. And black people, obviously. Then the press went nuclear. Newspapers became weapons, with the white-owned ones and the black-owned ones going to war with each other in print. Each issue was a new volley. The Wilmington Messenger, the News and Observer, and other Democratic papers ran sensational stories claiming that black men were plotting violence, that white women were in danger, that the Fusionists were corrupt. None of it was true, of course, but fear sells, and holy shit, did it sell big. Alexander Manley, editor of the Wilmington Daily Record, the state's only black-owned daily paper, fired back with a now infamous editorial. He directly challenged one of the most explosive lies of the campaign, that white women needed protection from predatory black men. Manley pointed out that many interracial relationships in the South were actually consensual, and that the real epidemic of sexual violence was white men assaulting black women. It was a bold, factual, and furious rebuttal, but to white supremacists, it was heresy. The white press reprinted and distorted his words across the state, stripping away the context and presenting it as a threat. Every retelling made it sound more insulting, more dangerous. Politicians waved the clippings at rallies, yelling about defending white womanhood, and crowds howled for vengeance. By the fall of 1898, North Carolina was marinating in newspaper-fueled hysteria. At the center of it all stood Alfred Moore Waddell, a former Confederate officer and a man whose beard game I'd respect if he weren't such a racist piece of human trash. Or human piece of... Look, you know what I mean. That guy. On stage and in print, Waddell became the movement's mouthpiece, working crowds into a frenzy with apocalyptic talk of, defending white womanhood, and even urging them, though, to choke the Cape Fear River with black bodies. And they didn't just want to win the upcoming election, they wanted to make sure black political power was gone forever. So on November 8th, 1898, Election Day, well, the whole thing was a farce. Armed white men patrolled polling places, lost ballots, and generally made it clear to black voters that their choices were either vote and end up in the river or don't vote. Unsurprisingly, the white supremacists won. Then 2 days later, they decided even that wasn't enough. On November 10th, Waddell and about 2,000 armed men gathered in Wilmington. Their first target was the Daily Record, which they marched on and promptly set on fire, and stood outside with rifles to make sure no one put it out. Once the press was thoroughly silenced, they headed for City Hall. There, Waddell forced the mayor, the police chief, and the Fusionist City Council to resign at gunpoint. And because apparently democracy is just finders keepers if you bring enough people with Winchester rifles, he was made mayor on the spot. Oh yeah, and this wasn't just a political takeover. It was an all-out massacre. Armed white mobs poured into black neighborhoods, shooting residents, looting homes, and dragging people off the streets. The real death toll is unknown, ranging from a couple dozen to several hundred, with most historians figuring the higher figures the more accurate ones. But nobody really knows because bodies were just dumped in mass graves or the river. More than 2,000 black residents fled the city entirely, many never to return. In a single day, Wilmington went from a majority black, politically integrated city to a majority white segregated one. And the property, businesses, and homes left behind snapped up by white residents, often for pennies, which made it not just a coup, but also ethnic cleansing for profit. Now you might be thinking, okay, but surely someone at least tried to stop this, right? The governor, the state militia, the federal government? Not really. North Carolina's Governor Daniel Russell, himself a fusionist, did initially try to quell the white mob as it was forming, but failed and then kind of went into hiding. State officials looked the other way, and in Washington, President William McKinley did do a couple of things, but one was Jack and the other was shit. No troops, no investigation, no charges, because it was written off as just one of the South's race problems instead of the violent massacre that it actually was. The people who orchestrated the coup not only got away with it, they were celebrated. Waddell stayed mayor until 1905 and is still listed in some historical summaries without even a footnote about the fact that his job interview was held at gunpoint. And within just 2 years of the bloody takeover, the North Carolina legislature had passed a constitutional amendment requiring poll taxes, literacy tests, and a grandfather clause that effectively wiped black voters from the rolls. The state wouldn't see significant black voter registration again until the civil rights movement some 60 years later. For over a century, the coup was whitewashed as a race riot, allegedly started by black residents. School children in North Carolina were taught that it was a justified response to Negro domination, which is the kind of language reserved for the guy who's so annoyingly racist at rallies that the other bigots tend to avoid him. Textbooks rewrote the event's details, and in many schools, it wasn't mentioned at all. Some local histories even portrayed Waddell as a stabilizing figure who brought order back to the city, rewriting terrorism as community service. The truth stayed buried in archives and family memories. For generations, descendants of the victims said their elders simply never talked about it. Some didn't even know it happened until the 90s, when researchers and journalists began piecing together the real story from old newspaper clippings, letters, and government records. That silence obviously was quite intentional. The men who staged the coup made sure to control the story, calling it a riot, implying chaos instead of coordination. The newspapers that had fueled the hate campaign kept printing the same bullshit for decades, shaping how North Carolina remembered, or rather didn't remember, its own history. The victors had successfully written the story, and the victims' voices were erased. Wilmington's black prosperity was gone, as was its place in the public record. It took over 100 years for the truth to start clawing its way back. In 2000, the North Carolina legislature finally established the Wilmington Race Riot Commission to investigate what really happened. 4 years later, their report made it official. This wasn't a race riot. It was a violent, premeditated overthrow of a legally elected government. They detailed how black citizens were murdered, their property stolen, and their political power erased. But even then, there was no federal apology, no reparations, no effort to return stolen land or compensate descendants. In recent years, historians, filmmakers, and community leaders have been trying to reclaim the story from the whitewashing. A PBS documentary called American Coup, Wilmington 1898, aired in 2024, telling the story plainly for the first time on national television. Local activists have pushed for memorials, historical markers, and for renaming schools and streets that still inexplicably honor the douchebags who helped orchestrate the violence. But even today, some officials bristle when the subject comes up. They say it divides communities or reopens old wounds, which is just a polite way of saying they'd rather not talk about the time their racist, murderous predecessors overthrew democracy and got away with it. That tension runs deep. Some descendants of survivors describe generations of silence, fear, and lost wealth. Entire families who once owned homes and businesses in Wilmington vanished from the city's property rolls overnight. One woman interviewed by the Equal Justice Initiative said her great-grandmother had told her, "If it ever happens again, run." That's not history. That's inherited trauma still shaping lives more than a century later. Meanwhile, certain corners of the internet and even a few modern politicians still downplay the event or frame it as a tragic misunderstanding. When state education officials proposed adding the Wilmington coup to high school curricula, critics claimed it would promote division. As recently as 2023, North Carolina lawmakers debated how or even whether to teach the event in public schools. Some local museums have faced pushback simply for using the word massacre instead of riot. Think about that. In 2025, there are still people fighting over what to call it rather than what to learn from it. The Wilmington coup wasn't just a crime against one city. It was a playbook for dismantling democracy. And if that playbook feels uncomfortably familiar right now, congratulations, you've been paying attention. It's crazy how successful the cover-up was. Generations grew up never hearing about it, which means the warning it carried, the one written in the ashes of the Daily Record and the blood of Wilmington citizens, never got passed down. And when warnings aren't remembered, they have a way of turning into previews. So that's the short version of the Wilmington coup, but the story does not end there. Its legacy shaped laws, lives, and what North Carolina chose to remember, or forget, for generations. But history leaves receipts, and it's on us to read them. Share this story, debate it, but don't let it fade again. And if you want to help directly to ensure it stays remembered, the Wilmington 1898 Museum Project is in the works right now and could use your help. Link is below. I'm Jeff McLaughlin. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with another piece of history they conveniently forgot to teach you.